I'm really delighted today to introduce Dr. Neil Boyd from the School of Criminology. Dr. Boyd is a professor of criminology, trained lawyer, and expert in the analysis of Canadian criminal law, homicide. You probably have heard him in the context of narcotics legislation, the legal control of pornography, workplace violence, and biology of male and female violence. He's a frequent commentator on the CBC. His most recent book is Understanding Crime in Canada, An Introduction to Criminology, published in 2014, I think. Is that correct, or is there a more recent version?
I think it's 15.
2015.
It was actually 14, but
okay.
It says 15.
He's also worked
salary review
on tremendous collaborative things with Vancouver Senator Larry Campbell and Sun writer to explore the social history and current realities of the downtown east side. And that book, 1,000 Dreams, was shortlisted for the Robert Haig Brown Prize and the Donner Prize, and won the George Riga Award for Social Awareness in Literature. And I have to say, that's a great honor. It is a great honor. The sixth edition of his textbook, Canadian Law, will be published by Nelson in the fall or has been published, I would think, by now. And he's a passionate resident and leader on Bowen Island with interests as varied as pollination and bee protection. So Dr. Boyd is going to entertain us this morning with his particular view on the history of crime in Canada. But I also want to introduce Madi Tagipur, who is a mentor with the School of Criminology, and her colleague, Erin Carter, sitting to her left. These students have agreed to lead and facilitate the question and answer period. So Dr. Boyd, thank you very much. All yours.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, I'm particularly interested in what crime rates tell us about our society, in the subject matter then of whether we have become a kinder, gentler Canada over the past 50 years. And I suppose you might think, if you read the House of Commons Hansard, that the key to making Canada a safer, more gentle society is in legislation. Because after all, if you go back 100 years into House of Commons debates, again and again, the focus is on what kind of punishment should we have for homicide? What kind of punishment should we have for those who traffic or have possession for the purpose of trafficking in various illegal drugs? These are the kind sentencing, penalties, punishment. That's what criminal law is mostly about when you look at the floor of the House of Commons and the kinds of changes that have been made. But the argument I want to make today is that those changes that have been made over time, those penalties, the criminal law really has very little to do with the kind of violence that we experience, the kind of crime that we experience over time. And I have two charts that I'm going to try to make sense of. The first is Homicides and Attempted Murders Canada over the past 50 years, 1964 to 2014. The other looks at property crime and other kinds of crime. But to give you a sense of how I'm going to structure this, I'm going to talk about crimes against people, mostly homicide. I'm going to talk about property crime, and I'm going to talk about drug crime. We could talk about other forms of so-called victimless crime, prostitution, pornography, and so on, but I'm going to focus on drug crime because I think that's really the preeminent area of what we call other kinds of crime. So here we see that in 1964, the homicide rate was about 1.5 per 100,000. And then about, 13 years later, 1977, it increased to 3 per 100,000. Today it's back down close to 1.5 per 100,000. So the question is, these are pretty significant changes. Last year, for example, we had about 600 homicides in Canada. If we were at 1977 levels, we would have experienced 1,200 homicides. So what changed? Why did the murder rate go up? Well, some people would say, the murder rate went up because that was a lenient government, or we didn't take a hard enough line. Well, in 1976, we abolished capital punishment, and since then, homicide rates have been going down. Now, the last thing I would want to suggest is that homicide rates have been going down because of the abolition of capital punishment. That's not the case at all. But what I'm suggesting is that if you put on this graph all of the various kinds of legislation in relation to criminal law that were introduced between 1964 and 2014, you'd be very hard-pressed to find any relationship between those initiatives and the extent or the amount of homicide that we've experienced. So what did happen between 1964 and, or more pointedly, between 1966 and about 1977? Well, the divorce rate increased 400%. Alcohol consumption increased 50% per capita. The percentage of young men in the population in Canada was twice what it is today. That's important because we know that crime is really a young man's game, that about 70% of homicides are committed by young men between the ages of 18 and 35. When they make up 17% of the Canadian population, which was the case during that era in the 1970s, and today they make up 9% of the population, you can expect a bump upwards. So part of this is demographic, but if you look carefully at that data, that doesn't fully explain the change. There's something else going on. It was a time of profound cultural change. A 400% increase in the divorce rate is quite significant. There was a huge uptick in domestic violence cases, in some senses because women, for the first time, were gaining a measure of economic freedom. In 1966, for example, there were 2.2 million women working in the labor force in Canada. By 1975, there were 5.5 million women. That's an extraordinary change. And that was the first signal that women were beginning to develop economic power, while not rivaling the economic power of men, nonetheless giving women the opportunity to leave unpleasant marriages, giving women the opportunity to chart their own courses. The birth control pill was a technology that actually, I mean, you know, none of you could relate to this too easily, but if you've lived, because it was always there. But it was something that was developed in the 1960s and fundamentally changed the nature of relationships between men and women, and probably had something to do with the 400% increase in the divorce rate. There were new drugs introduced. Up until 1965, there were no more than 1,000 convictions for all drug offenses annually in Canada. 1967, there were 1,000 convictions for possession of marijuana alone. Initial response, get tough on this. Half the people who were convicted of possession went to jail for up to 2 years, but they went to jail. But by 1975, there were 40,000 people convicted of marijuana possession alone. So an illegal drug industry that was completely unregulated increased quite dramatically. And what Statistics Canada referred to as unsolved gangland homicides, there were 26 of them between 1961 and 1967. There were 125 of them between 1967 and 1975. A 600% increase in unsolved gangland homicides. That was the drug trade. Just fundamental cultural changes around drugs, around sexual relationships, around alcohol consumption. You know, you might not think it's much, but imagine if the whole country increased, on average, its consumption of alcohol by 50% in the space of a decade. That's what happened between 1966 and 1975. Timothy Leary urged the young to tune in, turn on, drop out. We had the Vietnam War, an intense kind of social conflict. So what I'm arguing then is we can talk about this later, I'm happy to answer questions, but all of those cultural changes drove the homicide rate up to a peak in about 76. What drove it down again? I'm kind of a fan of Steven Pinker's argument, the better angels of our nature, when he talks about civilizing process. Well, the 60s in many ways was a decivilizing process. If you think of those kinds of changes, that's not very civil. Increases in divorce and misery of one kind or another, an unregulated drug trade where violence is a consequence not of the drugs themselves, but of the fact that you have this unregulated trade. And you can't go to the Better Business Bureau to complain about the unethical conduct of your business associate. You can't go to civil court to claim damages. So in some small number of circumstances, violence becomes the response to a dispute. a minority of circumstances, but nonetheless a response. So what happened here? Between 1977 and the present, where we go back down to close to 1.5 per 100,000 as a rate of homicide. Steven Pinker's argument is that a lot of this is a cultural change around civilizing influences. Women's rights. Women didn't have the right to vote until 1927. Women basically had no economic power, as I've just said, relative to men until the mid-1970s. So the rights of women, that was a fundamental, probably the most important shift in terms of the rights revolutions. But you also have changes around ethnic minorities, the diversity that we have in Canada, and the acceptance and endorsement of that diversity. That is a revolution in a way of thinking. Gay rights, I remember working for the Royal Society of Canada on a project having to do with AIDS in the early 1980s and fearing that the AIDS epidemic was going to produce this huge backlash against gay men and women. Particularly gay men, and it did not. In fact, the opposite thing happened. What we have now is, of course, a huge change around gay rights and an acceptance of gay rights, and so that's another big shift. There's also the issue of children and children's rights. I recall growing up, I'd go down to the local grocery store, and you'd see a mother just wailing on her child, like hitting the child. I mean, if that happened today, that would be actionable. Somebody would call the police. There would be some sort of response to that. So huge change in children's rights and their freedom from assault. And animal rights. You might remember a couple of years ago, there was a German Shepherd left in a dumpster in Kitsilano, and everybody was outraged, and there is increasingly a desire to hold people accountable for cruelty to animals, and increasingly a recognition that people who engage in that kind of conduct are also the kinds of people who might harm people. So these fundamental shifts around rights, actually, when you think about all of them in context, they all point in the direction of a less violent, more caring society. Around gender, around children, around sexual orientation, around diversity, and if that's something that we have internalized as a culture, if it's no longer acceptable to smack your child around in the supermarket, for example, that cultural shift might be a very good explanation underlying the kind of shift that we've seen in the homicide rates over time. The one thing I want to leave you with on this subject of the homicide rates is that you really cannot see any law that has been changed so as to, you can see some changes in approach, restorative justice, for example, which is again, I think, a reflection of this kind of approach, of greater tolerance, of understanding, of integration. But in terms of penalties, like the imposition of tougher sentences, mandatory minimums, none of that has done anything but cause harm, for the most part. It certainly hasn't led to decreases in personal rates of crime or in rates of homicide. Okay, so that's crimes against people. How long did I talk there? About 15 minutes?
You're good.
I got 10 minutes, 15 minutes?
You got 15
I got 15 more minutes, okay. Whoops. There. Okay, so this is a bigger picture. There's the total. You can see that the total looks kind of like the homicide graphic goes up. It starts to drop at a much later period of time in the 1990s. And I'm going to talk first about property crime. You can see that property crime appears to decline from 1995 to the present. I'm going to make the argument that I'm not really at all convinced that it's declined, and I would actually suggest that property crime might well be increasing. Now, that's because of how we think about property crime. How many of you today received an email that, had you responded to it, might have led to a loss of money on your part? if you had provided, for example, a credit card, if you had, how many people have had their visas hacked or their emails hacked? It's not, I mean, lots of people. I've had my visa compromised. No, I don't think I booked a flight on Air France for $500. What's interesting about that, I raised that, so what happens in those cases? The hundreds of thousands of people who have been defrauded via Visa cards or perhaps via the internet. Do the Visa companies, TD Visa, American Express, etc., do they report these instances as crimes? No, they don't report them as crime. And that's a huge number. I mean, we can't even begin to contemplate. And the amount lost is in the billions. What we have defined as crime in terms of our crime rates is theft from auto. Immobilizers have made that much more difficult. Theft of cars. Immobilizers, again, have made that a much more difficult task. Shoplifting. Security cameras everywhere have made that more difficult. Robbery. Security cameras in banks have made that more difficult. What you can see over time is what a fellow who used to be with us in criminology, Graham Farrell, has referred to as the securitization hypothesis. The idea that we have effectively placed security around property and around standard forms of property crime so that they have really dropped quite significantly over time. And that, when Graham Farrell writes about the crime drop, he says that the reason for it is this securitization. Now, and I've talked to him many times about this, so I would say about three things to him. First of all, that really can't account for interpersonal crimes such as homicide, that explanation. And secondly, you're just looking at, in making that claim that crime has dropped, property crime going down here, you're really engaging in a very narrow conception of what we mean by property crime. Property crime in 2017 is very different from property crime in 1980. And yes, I think Graham Farrell's absolutely right that securitization of various kinds has dramatically diminished so-called street-level property crime. Shoplifting is much more difficult. But cybercrime, I mean, it's not by accident that we have a Center for Cybercrime in the School of Criminology. And it's not surprising when I ask that several of you put up your hand to say that, yes, you have been the victim of this kind of crime. So when I ask the question, is Canada a gentler, kinder society? I think on the interpersonal level, generally speaking, yes, because we've internalized certain kinds of values around human rights, around tolerance, diversity, that have led us to declining rates of violent crime. But when we get to the subject of property crime, I think it's a very different portrait. I don't think, if you look at the big picture of what we mean by property crime, that you can really claim that property crime is going down at all. I might even be inclined, although I don't have great data because it's not reported as such, it's not reported as crime. So it's difficult to say that crime is going up. But we do know that there are all kinds of losses, which we would characterize quite appropriately as frauds, that are not reported to police. And if you don't report that kind of loss, can you really say property crime is going down? I would say, some people say it's not a crime drop, it's a crime swap. We've swapped one kind of property crime for another. That's probably a fair statement, a relatively accurate statement. But what's maybe more interesting is, what's the extent of the loss? I would argue it might be much greater today than it was in the past. Is it the same cast of characters carrying out property crime today as 30 years ago? The same group of people who are, breaking into cars and so are not able to. So I'm not sure that's the case at all. I'm not sure that this is the same group of people. But again, we're just beginning to recognize how prevalent that kind of property crime is and how we need to be a lot more careful. I would be very reluctant to say that there's a lot less property crime today in Canada than there was 30 years ago. I would be more comfortable saying that there might well be more property crime. Okay, so the third area I want to talk about in the context here of other kinds of crime. What's interesting about this, it's almost non-existent here in terms of a rate per 100,000. It's increased dramatically, quantitatively and in terms of a rate as well, in absolute terms and in per capita terms. But what happened with drugs is kind of interesting. It's one area where, if you look back to 1900, there were no drug laws. No substance was criminalized. It was in 1908 that we criminalized smoking opium in Canada. Other countries followed suit as, in large measure, in response to the Shanghai Opium Commission of 1908. And we see cocaine was criminalized in 1911. Marijuana was criminalized in 1923 in Canada, all in the space of about 15 years. Now, from the vantage point of 2017, we look back at this and we can ask questions about, well, what about tobacco and alcohol? We keep talking about alcohol and drugs, as if alcohol wasn't a drug. When every piece of evidence that would make any scientific sense would propel us in the direction of concluding that alcohol is very much a drug. What did we do back then? Well, I think what we did was to criminalize drugs not on the basis of the public health risks that they produce for us, but on the basis of politics, economics, ideology, culture, and history. The good drugs of the first world, tobacco, alcohol, pharmaceuticals, were not criminalized. The drugs that were criminalized were the drugs of the developing world. Opiates, coca, cannabis. And the line that we draw between illegal and illegal drugs has given us no end of difficulty over the past 100 years. At first it wasn't a big deal, I suppose you could say, because all of these laws were put in place, and the penalties initially, back in 1908, if you were if you ran an opium smoking factory, you were given 6 months to sell off your existing stocks, and the maximum penalty was 3 months in jail. By 1929, it was 7 years in jail. By 1954, it was 14 years in jail. And marijuana, cocaine, and the opiates were all classified as narcotics, despite the fact that only one of those drugs could legitimately, in pharmaceutical terms, be described as a narcotic, opium. In 1954, 14 years, and in 1961, life imprisonment. There was a very vigorous debate on the floor of the House of Commons about whether capital punishment should be imposed on those who traffic in narcotics. Remember, marijuana, cocaine, or the opiates. And by about a 2-to-1 margin, the government of the day decided that no, life imprisonment would be good enough. So here we have this history, this trajectory going from 1908 to 1961 of increased penalties for both the possession and distribution of these drugs. And in any given year, between 1908 and 1961, there were never more than 1,000 convictions for all illegal drugs combined, for trafficking, for possession, for all offenses. By 1966, as I said earlier, there were 1,000 convictions for marijuana possession alone, and by 1975, there were 40,000 convictions for marijuana possession. Remember that I said that the penalties increased dramatically, so that in 1961, you had this life imprisonment and debate about whether we should impose capital punishment upon people who engaged in this activity. This is another good illustration of the fact that penalties really don't seem to matter. In the face of the toughest penalties ever, 53 years after the introduction of the first legislation, we see rampant disregard for the law in the case of cannabis. Again, this was a cultural change. The Beatles went to, the democratization of air travel was probably one of the best explanations I've heard for this change. It wasn't until the 1960s that most people could travel around the world, and when they traveled around the world, they found what Wilfrid Laurier had heard about back in 1908, that He could go to India and he would learn of the Sikhs who would use hashish and opium in much the same way that Lord Morley might enjoy a cigar or spirits. He said, but this was a view that I would impart privately to Sir Wilfrid and not to the people of North Waterloo. In other words, I'm going to tell the Prime Minister that there's a contradiction here and that their use of opium and hashish isn't really any different from Lord Morley's use of a cigar and spirits. But that's not a view of this situation that I would ever impart to the people. So, back in 1908, we knew there was a knowledge base about how arbitrary these distinctions were. And now, of course, we've got quite a mess. I'm not going to get into too much detail other than to say there have been a number of changes over time that have led us to a crisis around fentanyl and carfentanil today. I mean, it's a very detailed discussion. I won't get into that so much. Just to say that the increase around drugs all proceeds from the basis that drug use and drug distribution are moral, criminal offenses rooted in morality in much the same way that personal crimes and property crimes are deemed to be moral offenses. But in fact, when we look more carefully at this, these are really public health issues. How many people are interested in using opiates or cocaine? Less than 1% of the Canadian population. It's been that way for about the past 30 years. But this is a segment of the population who have a significant range of difficulties, mental health difficulties, difficulties with substance abuse. I could go on. I guess I'm getting close to 30 minutes.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, this is a good point to wrap up. So what am I saying in total? I'm arguing that, yeah, Canada is a kinder and gentler society than we were in 1964 in terms of interpersonal crime. There is more respect for women's rights. There's more respect for gay rights, for diversity, for social, ethnic, religious diversity. There's more respect for animals' rights, for children's rights. So all of that civilizing process, all of those civilized and civilizing changes have a big role to play in diminishing the extent of violence that we experience. I am horrified by the election of Donald Trump, because he seems to me to represent very much a pushback in the other direction. You greet disagreement with anger and contempt. You misstate reality. He said yesterday or 2 days ago that the murder rate's the highest it's ever been. It's about the lowest it's been in 30 years. And he talks about fake news. So anyway, let's not go too far down that road. And then when we look at property crime, I think we have to be a little more careful. I'm not sure that we've actually seen a decrease in property crime at all. We just need to have we need to reconceptualize the way that we think about property crime. It's not street level property crime that we're dealing with anymore. It's crime that comes through computer networks, crime that comes through your credit card. But basically it's crime ultimately, I think, derived from cyberspace. And that's very much property crime. And then with drugs, there's some positive signs. We're starting to recognize that the entire idea of criminalizing certain drugs and then promoting drugs like alcohol and tobacco, which are incredibly destructive, and continuing to say, this may be one thing if I convince you, never to say alcohol and drugs. Alcohol and other drugs. But this morning I saw they talked about alcohol and drugs. And of course the alcohol industry has a vested interest in wanting you to think of alcohol as a beverage as opposed to a drug. So in that context, maybe there's a bit of optimism because we're moving towards a conception of this problem as a public health problem rather than a problem of morality. Most of us would probably agree with the notion that when we're talking about property crime and crimes against persons, we are talking about morality, and there is a place for the criminal law. But with drug use and distribution, maybe we need to rethink the issue. And there are plenty of signs. Government of the day, the Trudeau government plans to regulate and tax cannabis. And of course, that's a marked departure from what we have been doing since 1923. Okay, I'll end there, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you. So a kinder, gentler place, maybe, or in part. And this is one of the most frustrating things for general members of the public or younger students to grapple with, that the experience in post-secondary institutions leads you to introduce complexity, to negotiate across that chasm of, oh, yes, or oh, no, and to investigate that middle ground. This is what civil, intellectual discourse and analysis and the search for evidence can take you to. I thank you very much. And I want to introduce now Maddie and Aaron, and suggest that we'll be working kind of across here, and you'll come on up. They're going to be interrogating you, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Go easy, I promise. Okay, first of all, thank you for that. It was very informative, I thought. And I know that on behalf of the restorative justice class and myself as a restorative justice student, you did mention very briefly about restorative justice in society. And I'd like to ask you that, you know, although it's been well established that punitive measures are not as effective as a deterrent, our society is still largely based on those punitive responses to crime, and we haven't necessarily accepted restorative justice with open arms, to say. And I'd like you to talk about why you think that is.
Not so much my area, but what I would say is that it necessarily depends upon the cooperation of victims, and so that isn't always forthcoming. It's also arguably can be more time-consuming, so there it doesn't fit, as you say, with a punitive mindset, so that has to be overcome. Then the question, well, I mean, I think that there is a role for it, and it would be nice to see people moving away from a punitive frame. But I think there are a lot of what I would say practical obstacles, but also a limitation around a willingness to become involved in the process.
Thank you. And on that note, I'd also like to ask you something similar about our prison systems. So you spoke about the civilizing process that Pinker talks a lot about in his book, and our prisons are currently disproportionately represented to target particular groups. And I'm wondering if you would say that this is in part a reflection of a society that has not completely been able to go through the civilizing process.
Yeah.
In short.
In short, there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous population in prison. In part, that's because there's a higher level of criminality. But what we learn is that prison, for the most part, doesn't do people any good. It does more harm than good. The only real value in prison is for walking time bombs. About 30 years ago, I wrote a book. 30 years ago, I wrote a book about murder, and I interviewed, along with Liz Elliott, a former colleague, we interviewed a lot of murderers, probably a total of about 55, 60 murderers. One of the things, I think Liz already knew this, but one of the things I learned through that process was that most people made tragic mistakes in desperate circumstances, and they didn't need to spend all of that time in jail, and it usually didn't help them all that much. There were a few people I met who I'm just as happy to, but that's who probably should have been, and we can almost count that kind of category in one, and it's a very small number in terms of the 60 homicide offenders. It wasn't always the first-degree murders either. I remember a guy's second-degree murder. I thought, ooh, and Liz had pretty much the same take. But what I learned overwhelmingly was that people who commit the worst kind of crime, homicide, are not, for the most part, are far from walking time bombs. And so, you know, I've argued, I was at a symposium a couple of weeks ago at invitation to from Department of Justice, and we were talking about mandatory minimums. And I was trying to make the argument that, well, most people in the room were very committed to reducing mandatory minimums of all kinds, not quite all kinds. When it came to homicide, there was a reluctance to change the 25 years for first and the 10 years for second. But I said, well, you know, I don't think that's based in terms of fear of the political reaction rather than public safety. I think you could reduce the 25 down to 10 and the 10 down to 5 and it would have no impact on community safety. After all, you know, prior to the abolition of capital punishment in 1976, people who were sentenced to jail for homicides, regardless of the type of homicide, rarely ever did more than about 12 years in prison.
Thanks, Manning. Dr. Boyd, I've got a couple questions on cybercrime. You mentioned that earlier. So my first question, what are the difficulties behind measuring cybercrime, fraud or theft, within or outside of our jurisdiction?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, within the jurisdiction, problem is it's not reported as a crime. You know, the credit card companies, when they're defrauded, there were several of you, and myself included, put up my hand. So we've had that experience. That was a crime. You know, that was, in my case, I think it was theft of a total of about $700 or $800. But that gets, you know, here's a group of 40 people, for example, and maybe 10 people, half a dozen to 10 people have experienced that relatively recently. Start extrapolating to the Canadian population, you've got a huge number, but it's not counted. Outside the jurisdiction, it's kind of interesting because you know, we know in the recent election, the attempts that were made, it appears, in Russia to help Trump with his campaign. Those were that's cyber criminality of a kind. How do you arrest, like if you have somebody who's making and distributing child pornography, how do you, they're typically not within the jurisdiction, although I did find it interesting in one piece of Richard Frank, I think it was done recently, that southern United States, all those red states, were, you know, a locus for the production of child pornography. But the reality is, of course, that a lot of this takes place well outside the jurisdiction where the offending images or the cyberbullying or what have you is actually taking place. And it's very difficult. I mean, the Amanda Todd case is an interesting example of how you know, it's taken a huge amount of time and effort to try to extradite somebody who's responsible for a pretty heinous crime. So it's, as you say, I mean, it's both within the jurisdiction, you have difficulties because things aren't reported, that cybercrimes aren't reported as property crime, and then outside the jurisdiction, you've got enormous difficulties of detection, and the technology isn't sufficient sometimes to let you know exactly where this is broadcast from or where it was created, and resources. About 5 years ago, I did a project for BC Securities Commission on the Aaron mortgage fraud, and it was a fraud of totaled $300 million. And people across British Columbia, hundreds and hundreds of people were affected. We started drilling down into the people who were most affected, and the kinds of consequences that we found were enormous, like in terms of lost marriages, dysfunctional, all sorts of health problems, retirement savings. I mean, the people who invested in Aaron, for example, were mostly people in their 50s who had saved a total of $200,000 and they were heading for retirement. So they just didn't have enough to retire, and they were the victims. Now the principals in that particular case received 3 years and 6 years and were out in 1 year and 6 months, respectively. So, that's another example of lack of resources. I mean, that took an enormous amount of effort. As one RCMP officer said to me, I can get a rapist from Surrey, sorry, it was about the Surrey slur. Yeah. Rapist from Surrey off the street in 10 days. I can't even begin to put a case against a fraudster. Years it takes. The extent of resources required to actually proceed against these people is just enormous.
So you did touch a little bit on my second question. I was going to ask you, so credit card companies, they don't want to report these sorts of crimes.
Yeah.
What can we do to encourage them to report them so that we have a better understanding of how much property crime?
I guess you'd have to say there must be some incentive in it for them. What's in it for, if I was the credit card company, I'd think, okay, what's in it for me? Why would I want to be, that's just too much time and bother. Am I going to get the money back? No, I'm not going to get, it's a bit like why I had my car broken into about 15 years ago up here, and I didn't bother to report it, and I felt a bit guilty, but then I realized, I know I didn't bother to report it because nothing's going to happen. I'm not going to get my tennis rackets and my groceries. I don't know. They took groceries and tennis rackets and all the change that was in the box and smashed a window. My insurance will cover. So if we put ourselves in the position of the credit card companies, why would they do that? The only way they're going to do that is that there's an incentive, because they're not going to get the money back either. So it's an intractable problem.
Shall we open it up to the audience now?
So, opening up for questions to the audience. I'm looking at you, Restorative Justice Clause.
We have time for perhaps 2 or 3.
Yeah, my question is about the envelope of crimes. The companies, the corporations give bribes to people to get the contracts.
Oh, corruption.
Yeah, corruption. Is it a crime in terms of your statistics?
Yeah, I would say that that's another form of property crime, and it's a very serious one. Right now we've got a government in the United States that wants to repeal Dodd-Frank and all of those protections that exist to limit the extent of corruption and to limit the kinds of things that went on in 2008 with the subprime mortgages and so forth. Corruption is a major problem. I'm the chair of the board of directors of the International Center for Criminal Law, Criminal Reform out at UBC Law, and we've just, I can make a pitch, we've just hired as a president a former deputy commissioner of the RCMP whose work has been wholly focused on corruption, money laundering, and trying to get a handle on just that issue. In Quebec, the Charbonneau Commission has been remarkably successful in dealing with corruption. They've had a long history, Duplessis, and but they're exemplary at the moment relative to other provinces.
And what is the impact of private prisons? I don't know whether we have in Canada in terms of crime, because the judges seems to get some profit out of it.
Yeah, I really dislike the idea of a private prison. Just the notion that you can lock people up and make profit from it is just kind of creeps me out as a concept. It's a bit like, it's not too different from the medical services issue.
Thank you.
Time for one last question from perhaps someone from the restorative justice class. Anywhere? Okay.
Oh, there's one here.
It's pretty, I don't know if it's maybe a bit basic, but the first case that's ever gone through our criminal justice system, the first fentanyl case, a man just got sentenced to 14 years and prosecution was looking for 18. Do you think that that's is that more of like a political, like a statement? Like what are they trying to get at with that, considering we have like sex offenders who aren't even getting that time, so.
Yeah, I had a conversation just about 3 days ago with Larry Campbell, who I wrote the book with, and he was saying, what do you think of the idea of non-user traffickers getting increased sentences for fentanyl distribution? I'm okay with that. I think that's not a bad idea, given the nature of harm. It's at least criminal negligence causing death. It's not a murder, but it's criminal negligence causing death, can be. But the reality is that the reason that you're not seeing very many charges go through Vancouver courts anymore is Vancouver City Police have recognized that the people they were processing were low-level users selling to low-level users, and what's the point in processing these people who have substance abuse and mental health problems? I'm all for trying to stop fentanyl, but I think ultimately I think there is quite a range of responses, all of which make some sense. One of which is treatment and tapering. One of which is a 12-step model. I kind of like the agnostic one better, but that's just my own, take on religion. And then maintenance and prescription. We've now got supervised injection sites in a number of jurisdictions. I don't think supervised injection sites are nearly as good ultimately as something like the Crosstown Clinic, which is heroin-assisted treatment, where people go and if you're dependent on heroin to the point where you might overdose repeatedly, then I think you're better off just getting the heroin. It's not actually very expensive. People get opiates in hospitals all the time. And again, that's one of the most telling findings, that almost everyone at some point in their life will have the experience of being in a hospital and be given a powerful painkiller, an opiate. And the last thing most of us want to do is keep doing it. When I broke my leg and had surgery about 15, 20 years ago, I remember saying to the nurse, no, not that strong, just a bit, no, I don't want to go in and out of consciousness. And so I guess my point is that we've got a group of people, the fentanyl, some of them are recreational users. I shouldn't try to say that they're all dependent, but these are people who have substance abuse and mental health problems who I think need assistance. And I would prefer to look at this as a model that a health issue, and we approach the person with the idea of how can we help this person.
Here we have one question that I neglected, and we
Okay.
go with the last one.
You said that punitive punishment isn't really best for society because it doesn't really reduce crime rate. But what about the idea that the punishment should fit the crime? Just like a moral obligation to make.
There's something to that. Like, in other words, for example, if you kill somebody, even if it's manslaughter, mostly you're going to do some time in jail. Mostly, not always. I think of LaValle, although she wasn't actually convicted of manslaughter. But denunciation, I think there's a point to denunciation. Sometimes we just, it's not about deterrence, it's just about denouncing conduct. And if nothing, I think there is a role there, but we have overplayed the punitive card relative to that important principle, though. I don't disagree with that.